Hi everyone, I'm Rachel and I'm from Founders Doc. I'm a lawyer based in Singapore and I've worked in Singapore and London as a lawyer. Today we'll be going through a couple of slides to compare the legal landscape between Southeast Asia, the USA, and Europe. A lot of people club Asia into one monogamous territory, but there are actually lots of nuances amongst different Asian countries. And today we're going to focus primarily on Southeast Asia because that is where I'm based. I'm based in Singapore. I love Southeast Asia and I would love to explore how Southeast Asia differs from other continents in terms of legal landscape and how we can work better together. Today's slides will comprise three main components. First, we'll be talking about the most distinctive element of Southeast Asia's legal landscape, of course, through my lenses. The second thing that we'll cover is the vibrant startup ecosystem in Southeast Asia. That really struck me when I came back to Singapore after studying for a couple of years in London and coming back, after working as well. And the third key topic that we're going to cover in today's slides is common oversights in the legal checklist when entering Southeast Asia. So without further ado, we're going to start rolling on the first key topic in our slides. The most distinctive element of Southeast Asia's legal landscape. Of course, Southeast Asia comprises of many different countries, ranging from Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, you name it. Each country is characterized by its own unique cultural qualities. So transacting business in Singapore would be very different from transacting business in, say, Malaysia or Indonesia. But in my opinion, the most distinctive element of Southeast Asia's unique landscape is the significance of family-owned businesses. Of course, there are other types of business which have got very strong footage in Southeast Asia as well, such as sovereign-owned companies. As many of you will be familiar with the likes of Temasek and GIC, these players play a significant role in the Southeast Asian landscape. However, when you're looking at private businesses and private enterprise, family-owned businesses are very significant. What I also observe is a transition between first generation, second generation, and third generation family businesses. So a lot of people in Southeast Asia may have migrated from other parts of the world, and then we call them the first generations, like my grandfather. And we see people building different businesses and evolving the businesses as time grows. So one typical roadmap could be like my family, they started off in Southeast Asia. My mom went abroad to study, and now I've gone abroad to study, and we're bring back fresh ideas in Southeast Asia and seeing how we can mesh the two cultural differences based on what we've learned overseas, as well as what we gather based on the cultural nuances that we have at home. So what we see is first generation families building businesses, second generation maybe working in MNCs or tweaking the family businesses, and the third generation looking at existing business structures and saying, hey, how can I make this better? And this translates into different legal norms. I would show you an example, illustrate an example. So in the manufacturing business, for example, in America and in Europe, we see very robust terms and conditions, master agreements, very robust legal teams vetting the legal contracts between commercial parties. But I know for a fact that in Southeast Asia, the use of invoices itself is how a lot of businesses are run. So what I see sometimes is instead of having long, lengthy master agreements with very lengthy terms and conditions, Asian businessmen tend to do business based on relationships, based on a pretty light and thin legal paper. But that does not mean that the business isn't good, or that doesn't mean that the business hasn't been well structured. It simply is a reflection of the different cultural norms that come into play. So when overseas investors enter into Southeast Asia, and when they do this thing called legal due diligence, they may get quite surprised that the legal documentation they see may not be as robust as the ones that they typically see, but we're just looking at things through different lenses. Moving on to our next key topic, the vibrant startup ecosystem in Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia is characterized by a young and growing population. What really struck me when I first came back from London 4 or 5 years ago was when I visited my friends in Jakarta, I came across this app called Gojek. And Gojek is not what we see it as in other countries. It was like a multi-app with various different functions ranging from Go Massage to Go Car to Go, you name it. It was like an e-wallet as well. And I was very surprised because that was the era that characterized Uber as a singular app, mobility app, where Grab was a singular mobility app as well. And I was thinking, hey, there are so many vibrant startup ideas that was brewing in Southeast Asia that we didn't know about, maybe because of language barriers and the lack of publicity. But Southeast Asia is filled with so much vibrant ideas, which it's just a gold mine waiting to be tapped on. So the three features that I think characterize Southeast Asia is a young and growing population with a desire to succeed. I'm sure a lot of people around the world have a desire to succeed, but what really characterized Southeast Asia for me when I came back was the hunger that I saw in terms of the hunger to succeed. So we have younger populations working very hard, and we have incoming Asians who have lived overseas who are also hungry to make their mark in their businesses, and that translates to lots of opportunities. What really helps is that in certain countries, perhaps not so much Singapore because the cost of living is very high, but in certain countries, the barrier to entry is not very high. So a lot of my friends came back from, after studying overseas to set up their own businesses and to, start their own companies. And the cost of building and setting up the company was not significantly so high that it was a barrier to entry. The third trend that I observe is many Southeast Asians applying global principles in local context. Now, whether or not they study overseas, we have the internet, we have mass social media, and we observe different trends that are happening around the world, and we apply it to the local context, but in its own unique way. So, for example, we can take Indonesia as an example. What is unique about Indonesia, for example, is not a lot of people have bank accounts. Not a lot of people have information that people typically take to assess a credit score. So we have new startups coming into Indonesia to find innovative ways to provide the credit scores that's necessary for people to lend people money. And since credit cards are typically issued by banks, they've come up with innovative ways to say, how can I still provide credit to the young and growing population that's increasingly affluent without relying on the traditional ways of assessing credit scores that doesn't not work in Jakarta or in Indonesia? So that is just one application of the unique ways people are coming in to solve problems. The other thing that I think is important when we look at Southeast Asia as a vibrant startup ecosystem is to understand the nuances between the different countries. So when establishing a business in Singapore, we can't just copy and paste the same business model in different Southeast Asian countries, because as much as outsiders look at us with a lens that, hey, everyone is Southeast Asian and they have maybe similar cultural habits, but the nuances between different countries is actually quite significant. So even when I would consider myself a semi-businesswoman, expand into different Southeast Asian countries, I'm quite careful about the different cultural nuances that are present. How, for example, they perceive women. How should I present myself on the table? How should I speak to elderly people and show them the respect that they need? So, being aware of the countries and the culture that you're entering into is quite important when entering into the Southeast Asian market. But that's not to say that this is a barrier. You just got to get used to it. Now we're going to spend a little bit time on the common oversights in the legal checklist when entering into Southeast Asia. So the key thing that I hope would be taken back at the end of this presentation is this single message. The legal checklist that applies in the US and Europe may not always apply to Southeast Asia. Well, this could be a good thing, and this could be a more negative thing, but let's explore it further. On the first bullet point, having a good understanding of the local cultural fabric of the country is important. And I'll use an example. A lot of Southeast Asian venture capital funds have quite different legal terms that they request from founders. But that is not to say that they are more aggressive, and that is not to say that they're less founder friendly. It is just that the cultural norm and what they're used to when signing documents with founders tends to be a little bit more robust and aggressive. And the founders will counter by saying that, hey, we trust the reputation of the VC funds over here, and even though the terms are a bit more robust, we are willing to accept those terms. So that is one example of, maybe entrepreneurs entering in from Silicon Valley may look at the legal terms in Singapore and say, hey, these do not look like friendly terms, but that could just be a reflection of different cultural norms. And that kind of like pivots the other way around as well. Some Southeast Asian founders or Southeast Asian founders who have established their businesses in Singapore but have lived overseas for a while actually want to go overseas to get investors on board because they prefer the legal terms that are presented overseas. But I think at the end of the day, the essence is the same, which is that, the VC funds are keen to support the founders, but the language they speak is simply different. So having a good understanding of the local cultural fabric of each country is important. And that is just one example of how, that could manifest. The second point is keeping in mind that the working circle is a small one and that the reputation is quite important. So Southeast Asia is like this little, a fun clubhouse and people know each other. So the very aggressive and very, business-like tactics that could be employed overseas or in different countries where the market is more competitive may not exactly work the same way in Southeast Asia because the network is pretty small. So one thing that's very important when you start building or entering the market is building good relationships first, having trust. And once you build a good rapport with different business partners, it sets a really good sort of like basic ground for you to build more connections and more networks. As we already know, the legal systems in different countries differs, and the legal systems in developed countries would differ from developing countries. And the legal system also differs from country to country in terms of what they would like to enforce, how fast they would like to enforce things and whatnot. So in this context whereby, legal systems are perceived in a different manner in different countries, the value of good relationships and having a community and network and support system that would back you up is very, very important. So that kind of brings me out to my last point for this particular slide, which is focusing on what is not written together with what is written. In fact, I would elaborate in my next slide a bit more about this phrase, but focusing, obviously what you have on written paper is important, but what you have not written on the paper is equally as important in every context actually, but much more so in Southeast Asia, in my opinion. One example would be, the strength of sovereign wealth funds in Singapore is very important, and building a good network with all sorts of different stakeholders is important. So the last thing you want to do is to establish a negative relationship with one key stakeholder, which either spreads the word spreads around that this person is particularly aggressive or does not hold his promise or whatnot, or is flaky. That word will spread around. So focusing on what is not written together, what's written is very important. And the other thing is also understanding that, and that is back to my first point on family-owned businesses. Some traditional family-owned businesses may not view the contract in the same lenses that people in other countries typically do. Let's take a very simple example, hypothetical example. Many businessmen will be familiar with this term called shareholders agreement, which is the document that governs the relationship between shareholders when they set up a new company or when you set up a new business. In the shareholders agreement, you may have different clauses like tag along rights, drag along rights, or certain procedures or processes that people need to adhere to before they transfer shares, for example, before they sell their shares to someone else. The shareholders agreement will also maybe set up certain benchmarks, certain KPIs that people expect different people to contribute. Depending on who you're dealing with, and that's when you really got to read your counterpart, they may or may not value what is written on the shareholders agreement as much as you do. So that perception would differ a lot. Let's say if you're dealing with a person who's younger and perhaps a bit different, will be very different from someone who's a bit older. And I've seen instances where people who have signed the shareholders agreement will say, yes, I understand this was what was signed on paper, but this was not what was intended at the point that the document was signed. And on that basis, they actually litigate and say that, what we signed was not what was intended. And I would expect you to know that even though we signed this, let's say, for example, even though we sign a clause that says that we will sell the company in 10 years, we actually did not mean that. Obviously, I would understand, foreigners scratching their head saying like, it's black and white. It's we said that we're going to agree that we're going to sell the company in 10 years. But they could be coming from a perspective of like, yes, this is a family-owned business. We value the cultural heritage associated with business. We value the brand name associated with business. This is a pride to us. And we thought the meaning was that you're going to sell it back to us. So having a clear understanding of what people actually intend is very important. Obviously, as a lawyer, I would have to say that the best way to protect yourself is not only to make sure that you read what is in between the lines, but if possible, you can also try and distill as much as possible what is in between the lines and make it crystal clear before you enter into a transaction. So for example, if people rush into a term sheet or people rush into an agreement and say, let's just start doing the business. We're a businessman, we understand what we're talking about, and you just want you to sign an agreement, maybe you can hold back a little bit and try and understand what they truly are trying to say with each clause and provision, and try to really understand what their aims and objectives, what's the politics behind the entire business before you actually sign a document. Because once you sign the document, it's very hard to go back into the negotiation stage to try and figure out what people are talking about. Or if you try to unsign what you've signed because you feel that, hey, there was some sort of misunderstanding, then you could come across as being, not trustworthy, not a person of your own word. So how about a significant quote here? So there's so many significant quotes that we could describe Southeast Asia with, and I'm sure all of you would characterize Southeast Asia with your own significant quote. But my own significant quote for this particular set of presentation would be focusing on what is unwritten, what is unsaid. So many a times when I enter into business meetings, I try to read the room. And I do understand that when I was working overseas, people just come in with their ideas, they're very forthcoming with their ideas, and they'll just present, right? And the most eloquent business presentation wins, the most eloquent person wins, the best business idea wins. But sometimes in Southeast Asia, I feel like I have to pause a little bit, try and understand my audience, try and understand who I'm dealing with, try and understand what's the dynamic, what's the politics behind it, and then proceed from there. So one interesting story that I read about was, in let's say UN meetings, people will be talking, people will be sharing their opinions, people will be publishing papers or publications to express their opinion, to express where they're coming from. They're very vocal. But there is an equivalent organization in Southeast Asia called ASEAN. And what I read, and I've never been to an ASEAN meeting, so I cannot verify whether it's true or false. But what I read is during the meetings, nobody will say anything. It's quiet. Things will be said, things will be considered, but the real decisions are made in the restroom. So whilst people are washing their hands, they'll be like, yes, okay, I think that's a good idea, or maybe I think I want to do this instead. So that is the first thing which I think really struck me, which is really reading the room and understanding how decisions are made, and however the decision is made overseas may not apply here. And that's the same thing for me when I went to work overseas as well. I was brought up in a traditional Asian culture whereby you don't talk too much, you don't talk over people, you don't you try to keep silent, and you try to remain very humble. So when I was at meetings or when I was at conferences, I didn't want to vocalize myself so much, and I would keep my opinions to myself. And my traditional thinking was, my hard work will pay off, and people will understand me through my hard work. But I had a feedback from my supervisor then saying that, hey, you're too quiet. People don't actually know what you're doing. I was like, oh gosh, I worked until 11 p.m. every day. Nobody knows what I'm doing. The big boss does not know actually, what's your contribution to the project. And you do not know what's your intention because you don't express yourself enough. So that was the problem that I faced when I worked in London. They said that I was not expressive enough. I was not putting my weight forth enough. But then it also flips around the other way when you come into Southeast Asia, which is because we were brought up with the thinking that, or at least I was brought up with the thinking that when you are in a project or something, you try to keep quiet and just work hard, and people would know that what your ultimate contribution to the project is. So I kept very silent, and I don't want to overexpress. So when overseas entrepreneurs come in, they could come in with a blast. They would come in maybe with the expectation that people will want to hear their ideas, and they may feel a bit demoralized when they feel like they're being turned around, people are not listening to them. But pause for a moment, because that is just our culture. Maybe it could have been a cultural misunderstanding. Maybe people just want you to slowly ease into knowing you first, and when they know you and when they build that rapport and trust with you, they would be more receptive to supporting your business idea. And what I've also further seen in Southeast Asia is, once you build that trust and rapport with a particular person, that person will support you however they can in their ability. So that has been a very interesting learning journey for me in the past 10 years, especially moving around in different countries. So the significant quote that people have when they enter into Southeast Asia, or when they move out of Southeast Asia, would differ from person to person. But what I personally have felt as most valuable has been the phrase, focus on what is unwritten rather than what is written. So that has been an amazing, interesting story for myself. So I hope that me sharing my story and me going through the different principles and different cultural nuances and all my own story, my own culture shocks, both being in Singapore, overseas, and coming back again, would be helpful when you enter into the Singapore market and the Southeast Asian market. It is a land of great opportunities, but we just have to navigate it right. And same thing for us when we go overseas. We just got to make sure that we navigate the market right as well, and to make sure that we reduce misunderstanding, we reduce the room for conflict, and that we are able to build businesses together in a mutually beneficial way. Thank you.